Melina Ansari is an international advocacy officer at Ad-Damir Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association, which is a Palestinian non-governmental organization that advocates for Palestinian political prisoners. Melina, thanks for joining us. Al-Damir is one of the more prominent human rights organizations which works to help Palestinian prisoners, political prisoners, prisoners of conscience under the Israeli occupation. I was hoping if you could perhaps tell us a bit more about the work that Al-Damir carries out and how it operates in the field.
Yes, of course. As you mentioned, Al-Damir is a prisoner support and human rights association. It has been established since over 30 years now. We mainly provide legal free aid to Palestinian political prisoners held both under the Israeli Authority occupation and the Palestinian Authority. Other than legal services, we do documentation through our regular prison visits and through the legal cases that we advocate for before Israeli military courts. So the documentation unit mainly focuses on documenting the systematic practices that the Israeli occupation subjects Palestinian detainees to. And later we have the advocacy unit, which works on advocating on behalf of the Palestinian prisoners, calling for their immediate protection and basic human rights as Palestinian detainees under Israeli occupation prisons and the PA. But most importantly, we also do communications with the United Nations to file complaints on behalf of the prisoners and to report on the systematic war crimes and crimes against humanity that the occupation does. Most recently, with the opening of an investigation in the International Criminal Court in the situation in Palestine, Al-Damir is also representing three child prisoner victims before the ICC for their forcible transfer in Israeli prisons that are located inside Israel's occupying powers territory, which is illegal under international humanitarian law. In addition, we also have like an awareness unit which works locally with the Palestinian community to empower Palestinians and let them know what their rights are as prisoners, and to make sure that they understand what legal obligation the Israeli occupation has towards them as prisoners.
You have many branches carrying out a lot of important work. And recently, Israel designated 6 Palestinian human rights groups, including Al-Damir, as terrorist organizations. What is the basis for this kind of accusation? Why do you think the Israelis are doing that?
As a clear answer to your question, I would say there is absolutely no basis for this designation and outlawing 6 prominent civil society organizations that work in different aspects of a Palestinian life. We have from the 6 organizations, these organizations work with children, political prisoners, women, farmers and peasants, international reports on the violations of the Israeli occupation, as well as research and documentation. So in a sense, there is absolutely no basis for this. This is part of the Israeli occupation systematic targeting of civil society organizations to silence them and isolate them from the international community, because they are at the forefront of the organizations that are opposing the systematic and arbitrary policies by the occupation. And we are working to change the paradigm and advocate for the rights of Palestinians on different sectors. And most importantly, we are calling the international community to stand against Israel as an apartheid regime and settler colonialism. So in a way, it is mainly to silence our organization, isolate us from the international arena, and discredit our organizations. Many United Nations organizations and international organizations have condemned this action and called that it is not only an attack against the Palestinian community, but the whole international community, which is 100% true, because we do legitimate human rights work that Israel is afraid that the international community will see.
And what are some of the other ways that you've received harassment or intimidation by the occupation forces, in your day-to-day operations?
As I mentioned, the designation of our organization and further outlawing them in the West Bank is not a single act. It has been, our organizations have been under attack for several years in this Israeli campaign to silence us. This includes residency revocation. For example, one of Damir's employees, Salah Hammouri, is now the Israeli Interior Minister approved a decision to revoke his Jerusalem permanent residency because he lives in Jerusalem under the allegation of breach of allegiance to the state of Israel. So in addition to the harassments we face, Israel as an occupying power is expecting us as human rights defenders and lawyers to serve loyalty to this occupying power. And there's, other than residency revocation, there are arbitrary arrests without any basis. And this is what we see that happened with the Palestinian health work committees, where it was also outlawed by Israeli military orders. And following the outlaw, several staff members were arbitrarily arrested. For example, the director, which is a 60-year-old Palestinian woman and human rights defender, Shada Aoudeh. Other than arbitrary arrest, there has been also travel bans on the employees. There has been intimidation and harassments, threats even of murder to the employees and staff. This is all important to understand, that these policies are, their only aim or goal is to intimidate the defenders of human rights and to make sure that they are in a way to deter any voicing of opposition against the apartheid regime.
So basically anything that they can do to stop you from carrying out your work?
100%, and the international community is just watching in silence and impunity. It's allowing the Israeli occupation to continue on these arbitrary arrests. And why I'm saying this is because till now, we haven't seen any affirmative action against the designation and outlawing of our organizations. It has only been limited to statements of condemnation. And this for sure does not affect the Israeli occupation in any way, but it gives it a green light to continue on its arbitrary policies in order to satisfy the international community. You know, we have been hearing from states parties to the Geneva Convention that till now there is no sufficient or concrete evidence that links our organizations to what the Israeli occupation is alleging. But this statement is in a way providing Israel a green light to create evidence and create links with our organizations and these alleged crimes. Because as Damir, we have seen in our legal work how the Israeli occupation is complicit with the Israeli judicial system, with the Israeli military prosecutor. It's a whole apartheid apparatus that only aims to maintain control over the Palestinians and criminalize any form of resistance against this occupation, even if it is legitimate human rights and civil society work.
Speaking of resistance, in October, Al-Damir released a report where you said that there are currently around 520 Palestinians who are held in administrative detention without charge. Could you maybe tell us exactly how administrative detention works and how it's used as a form of collective punishment against Palestinian prisoners?
To begin with, as of the 6th of December, there are 500 Palestinian prisoners under administrative detention without trial or charge, including 4 Palestinian children under the age of 17. The Israeli occupation relies on administrative detention, which is a procedure taken from the British Mandate defense regulations back in 1945. So the basis of this administrative detention goes back to the British Mandate that is still being implemented on the Palestinians. What this administrative detention entails, that the Israeli occupation forces can literally arrest any Palestinian without any charges and without continuing a fair trial for them. And all of this is based on secret material that is most of the time made up by the Israeli Shabak, which is the Israeli security or the intelligence services. What's even more arbitrary regarding this policy is that it does not have a strict limitation or duration. The Israeli occupation can indefinitely hold Palestinians under administrative detention and indefinitely renew their detention without trial or charges. This has created a loophole under the legal system where the Israeli occupation just calls this person is a threat to the security of Israel. We should detain them for an indefinite time. And we're talking about 4 Palestinian children under administrative detention that Israel says they impose a risk to the security of the region. What the risk is, nobody knows. Neither the detainee nor the lawyer are allowed to access these secret information, which creates also a psychological torture and ill treatment for the detainees because they are unaware of the charges that are brought against them, and they are unaware of the duration of the time they will be spending in Israeli prisons under extremely harsh conditions that do not meet the adequate living standards of a basic human life.
And this is something where they're held for months, and it's renewed again over and over, and they're kept for years, essentially, without charge, without trial. Is that correct?
Exactly. Administrative detention, as I mentioned, it is to be detained and for an indefinite amount of time, which means it could be 6 months, and which would be renewed for another 6 months, or another. There is absolutely no limitation for this detention. And this is why we say it is illegal under international law, because it does not follow any standards under the international law.
There are 6 Palestinian men who've gained a lot of attention because of their hunger strike while in administrative detention. Qaid Fasfous, Miqdad al-Qawasme, Ala al-A'raj, Ra'aq Bisharat, Rasim Abu Hawashi, Shadi Abu Aqr. Can you tell us briefly a little bit about how their hunger strike started and why it's so important? And what is Al-Damir's role in all this? What are you doing to help these prisoners and just everyone who's on hunger strike to protest administrative detention?
It's important to bear in mind that Palestinian prisoners initiate an ongoing hunger strike as part of the resistance of the Israeli occupation's arbitrary policies. It highlights the urgency and neglect towards their demands and ill treatment in Israeli prisons. The cases of the 6 Palestinian prisoners under hunger strike in the past 2 months has highlighted Israel's systematic reliance on administrative detention to detain Palestinians and maintain control over them. We've seen during these cases that the Israeli prison services and the Israeli occupation in specific aims to keep Palestinians inside prison. They do not care about their health conditions or what implications of the hunger strike has on their bodies and health and threat to life. They only aim to keep Palestinians in detention. When we're talking about hunger striking detainees reaching 100 and plus days, this is not something to take lightly at all. But we've seen the Israeli military system continuing on approving the renewal of administrative detention and freezing the administrative detention order. It's important to note that when the military courts freeze the administrative detention, it is in no way does it mean that the detainee is now free or the detainee is not under detention anymore. It only means that the Israeli prison services is not responsible for his life, whatever happens. And the cases of the 6 Palestinian detainees this time showed us clearly that the Israeli occupation does not care. They will continue to freeze the order, and then when they see the health condition of the prisoner slightly improving, they will re-establish the administrative detention order. So for them, it's a game that the Israeli judicial system gives legal cover to and allows. The freezing order, it explicitly means that the prisoner is now the responsibility of the hospital and not the Israeli prison services. And this entails additional ill treatment of the prisoners and detainees. What Adamir does in these cases is highlight the urgency of the cases. We do not look at hunger strikes as an individual case. We look at it at the broader picture of Israel's reliance on administrative detention. We communicate with the United Nations body and the Human Rights Council to ask them to communicate with the Israeli occupation and put pressure on them. But we have seen in this campaign of hunger strikes that not even the international organizations are able to put pressure on the Israeli occupation. And this is why we understand that condemnation is not enough, but further affirmative action on the Israeli occupation and apartheid regime is a must in these cases.
When we talk about putting pressure on the Israelis to release prisoners, especially the ones on hunger strike, what do you think contributed to that outcome? And can you actually call it freedom? Because, if at any time he can be detained again, do you think it's the work of al-Damir, the pressure in the media, the demonstrations that take place in Palestine, or maybe a combination of these things? Because there are, of course, other Palestinian prisoners who do go on hunger strike, who are under administrative detention, but they aren't let out always by the Israelis.
I have to be completely honest. The Israeli occupation also plays a game where it tries to show the international community that in some way they are assisting in improving the detention conditions or ending their policy of administrative detention. Most of the prisoners who ended their hunger strikes, it was following the Israeli occupations in a way promised that they will not renew their administrative detention, but none of them were immediately released from their administrative detention. The Israeli occupation only waited till the duration of their current administrative detention ends, and then they promised them that they will release. So in a way, it's important to understand that I'm not underestimating the work of my organization or the pressure of the international community, but we do need to understand that Israel plays a game where administrative detention is the best player of it is the Israeli occupation. They waited till the administrative detention of all the prisoners ended, then they released them. We still ask for pressure on the Israeli occupation, and we still appeal the decisions of the military courts because we have a responsibility for our people to satisfy all measures possible in our hands. But yet again, I'm not sure if we can call it freedom. Of course, it is an excellent and a significant importance that the hunger striking detainees ended their hunger strike. But we should bear in mind that they ended their hunger strike because the Israeli occupation did not renew the administrative detention. Now, there has been many cases such as Maher al-Akhras, who after his hunger strike and his release after his administrative detention, he was rearrested and charged under administrative detention several times. So we see that there is this reliance and complete use of it. Sorry, I just want to add that the 6 hunger striking detainees recently are all former prisoners who have been under administrative detention. They started this hunger strike because they know the history of administrative detention and how long the Israeli occupation can detain them without charges or trial. So they initiated their hunger strike from the beginning of their administrative detention. What I'm trying to say here is that no Palestinian is exempt from the arbitrary detention by the Israeli occupation. It can be renewed many times, and even if they are released, they can still be detained again under administrative detention. To add more to this bizarreness, Al-Damir also followed the prisoner exchange that happened in 2012, where a big number of Palestinians were released after an exchange deal in 2014. The majority of these prisoners who were released with this exchange were all rearrested and charged with the same allegations that were brought against them in the first time. this is to entail that the Israeli occupation for now will release the detainees, but I mean, I don't mean to say that they will be arrested again, hopefully not. But what I'm saying is we need to keep our eyes open on the Israeli occupation, because they may seem like for now they released the detainees, but there are still 500 Palestinians under administrative detention, including 4 children.
And I think in October, Al-Damir wrote that Kayed Fasfous, again, just as an example, he was watched by over 15 prison guards. He had his hands and feet handcuffed to the hospital bed. I mean, what conditions are the prisoners being kept in right now? You know, sleep deprivation, these other things. What is being used against them exactly, even when they are under medical care?
Yes, hunger striking detainees at first, since when they announced their hunger strike, the Israeli prison services, the first thing they do is isolate them and put them in solitary confinement. This only adds to the brutality and ill treatment of their detention. After the Israeli, or after a certain period of days on hunger strike, and when the health condition of the prisoner seriously deteriorates, they only transfer the hunger striking detainees to the prison clinic in Ramle, which is not a civil hospital that has adequate medical services and assistance and all the necessary equipment. It is a prison clinic that lacks the basic necessities for medical equipment. Only after the extreme deterioration of their health conditions are the detainees moved to civil hospitals inside the Israeli occupation, which is also a violation in international law, because Palestinians as an occupying people, as the occupied people, cannot be transferred inside the territory of Israel. This adds more constraints on them, because their family members cannot also visit them, because as Palestinians, they need specific permits to enter inside the Israeli territory. All of this is important, but what makes it even harsh conditions on the detainees on their hunger strike is the threat of force feeding. The Israeli occupation approved in their Knesset, which is the parliament in Israel, that force feeding is approved when necessary in cases of hunger strike. This is extremely grave and threatening for the life of the hunger striking detainees, because in the past, 3 Palestinians on hunger strike died because of force feeding, because of the Israeli occupation, and medical officers inserted the feeding tube in a different place where it's supposed to, which resulted in the death of 3 prisoners. You know, we keep saying about the bizarreness and arbitrary nature of the Israeli occupation, but as much as I would say, I cannot emphasize the ill treatment and degrading treatment that the detainees in general face, and those on hunger strike specifically face, just because they are demanding justice and liberty and using their bodies, which is the last resort they have to liberty.
Are there any closing remarks you'd like to add about the work you're doing at Al-Damir, about Palestinian prisoners in general, and where could people find out more about the important work that you're doing and help out as well?
Just a few notes or actions that I should mention. Our 6 organizations that were targeted by the Israeli occupation and designated as terrorist organizations and then outlawed do need constant support from the international community. Statements of condemnation have been pouring, and statements of support have been extremely meaningful and overwhelming. However, we do need the international community to follow these 6 organizations and see how they can take action. We are preparing a joint website for the 6 organizations where people can see how they can take actions and send emails to relevant politicians and policymakers. So I do urge the community to follow these organizations and see what actions they can take. On that note, as Al-Damir, you know, this year we will be celebrating 30 years of establishment. Until this day, we have been representing Palestinians in Israeli military courts and Israeli civil courts. To tell you the truth, there is no justice for the Palestinians through these courts. The military judge, the prosecutor, the interpreter in the court are all Israeli soldiers and some of them are Israeli settlers that only aim to control the Palestinians. So even the idea of the Israeli judicial system is completely, let me tell you, it's completely, I'm sorry, I don't know what exactly to tell you the word is, but
a joke.
It's a joke. It's a circus. It's an absolute circus. Our lawyers are standing before a military judge who's wearing soldier outfit and advocating against a military prosecutor who's also a soldier in a language that is enforced on the Palestinian and laws that are enforced on the Palestinians. There is no way to seek justice unless we end the Israeli occupation from its bases, and until we stand against the Israeli occupation, sanction the Israeli occupation, and cut all relations with it, it will continue on violating the basic rights of the Palestinians, such as freedom and right to health and right to dignity, but most importantly, the right to self-determination.
Elena, thank you so much for all the important work you do at Al Damir and for your time for coming on the program. I really, really appreciate everything you do. Thank you.
Thank you very much.